Welcome to your deep dive into the world of champagne. I know everyone always thinks we're going to talk about Dom Perignon, but this time we're going to do something different.
Yeah, it's a different kind of champagne story.
Buckle up, because the Brits, they played a much bigger role than you might think, even in shaping the taste of what we think of as champagne today.
Absolutely. We always think about the French side of things, but Champagne's journey, it's really deeply intertwined with English history and their preferences, even English scientific discoveries.
That's really cool. So we've got a real mix of sources here for this deep dive, historical overviews, deep dives into specific innovations, and even some
Oh
recommendations
yeah, we're going to get into
for
those.
English sparkling wines. But first, we need to rewind all the way back to the beginning. Did you know champagne wasn't always bubbly?
It's true, the Champagne region in France, they've been making wine forever, going all the way back to the Romans. But the early wines were still, and because of the cooler climate, they were often reddish.
Reddish. That's so different from what we think of today.
I know, that bubbly magic that we associate with champagne, it didn't appear until the 17th century.
And that's where those sturdy English glass bottles come in, right? I'd heard that those stronger bottles that the British were making, they actually had a hand in the accidental discovery of secondary fermentation, which gives champagne its fizz. Is that just a myth, or is there truth to that?
Oh, there's definitely truth to it. The Brits, they were really ahead of their time when it came to glass making. Their bottles were stronger, better able to withstand pressure, that pressure that builds up during that second fermentation. And sometimes, with those older, weaker bottles, that pressure led to some explosive results.
So basically, it was a happy accident thanks to resilient British glassware.
You could say that.
But this is where I get a little confused, because everyone always talks about Dom Perignon, like he invented champagne. But we're talking about the 1600s here.
Right.
Was he even around then?
He was. But Dom Perignon didn't actually invent champagne. It was already happening. And at first, it was considered kind of a flaw.
A flaw?
Yeah. But Dom Perignon's contribution was more about refining the quality of champagne. He focused on grape selection. And he was a pioneer in the blending practices that are still used today.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. So he was more of a master refiner than a straight-up inventor?
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got this accidentally bubbly wine, thanks to the British. But here's what I don't get. England was like a nation of beer drinkers back then. So why were they so drawn to this new bubbly drink?
Well, the British palate was evolving, developing a taste for lighter wines. And at the same time, social clubs were becoming really popular. Champagne was new. It had that sparkle. It fit right into that scene.
So it was like the new cool drink.
It was seen as elegant, cutting edge, something special.
I bet the champagne houses back in France, they were pretty happy about this British obsession.
They were thrilled. It was a huge marketing opportunity.
They must have been scrambling to keep up.
They saw the potential of the British market, and they wasted no time. They marketed champagne to that desire for elegance and status.
That makes sense.
And as the demand increased, well, they needed some logistical improvements.
Logistical improvements. You mean like those stronger bottles? I can imagine how many shipments just ended up as sticky, bubbly messes.
Oh, I'm sure there were a few casualties, but those stronger bottles were crucial, especially for shipping across the channel. And then there's a whole issue of the corks.
Oh, yeah.
Keeping those corks in the bottle and under all that pressure, that was a whole other challenge.
Yeah, I can imagine.
It led to better cork designs, and eventually those wire cages we still see today.
Wait, are you telling me those wire cages, the ones we associate with champagne, that's because of British demand?
Well, not a British invention exactly, but the need for a more secure closure, that was definitely driven by them. They wanted their champagne to arrive intact, ready to sparkle.
So thanks to the Brits, we have bubbly champagne in sturdy bottles with corks that stay put. What's next in this Anglo-Franco love affair?
Let's talk taste. You see, early champagne was actually quite sweet, more like a dessert wine.
Huh. So the champagne that we know and love, that crisp, celebratory, bubbly, it wasn't always like that.
Not at all. But the English, with their love of clarets and other dry wines, they weren't so into all that sweetness.
Really?
And this is where things get really interesting.
Okay, you've got me hooked.
So the champagne makers, they wanted to please their new British clientele.
Of course.
So they started adjusting the dosage,
Dose?
that little bit of sugar they add after fermentation, to balance out the acidity. And they started reducing it to cater to those drier palates.
So the Brit champagne, that dryness, we owe that to the Brits.
You could say that.
That's amazing. I never realized how much British taste preferences shaped an entire industry, but I'm sensing there's more to the story. They didn't just influence the taste and the bottles, right?
You're right, it goes even deeper. The British were making some serious scientific strides that would revolutionize champagne production.
Science and champagne, now this is getting really good.
In 1662, an English scientist named Christopher Merritt presented a paper to the Royal Society, and he was the first to describe adding sugar to wine to create those bubbles.
Wow.
This was huge.
Let me get this straight. While the French were perfecting the art of making champagne, the British were busy figuring out the science behind it.
Exactly.
That's so cool.
And it didn't stop with merit. The Royal Society, they're like the premier scientific institution in England. They wanted to delve deeper
Of course they did.
into the mysteries of champagne.
They sound like me.
They launched all these investigations into yeast and carbon dioxide, and this helped make champagne production more reliable and consistent.
Because before that, it was hit or miss.
It really was. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't.
That's so interesting.
But these British researchers, they laid the scientific foundation for the industry.
Wow. It wasn't just that the Brits loved their bubbly, they were actively shaping it. The bottles, the corks, the taste, the science. I'm starting to feel like we wouldn't even have champagne as we know it without them.
I think you might be right about that. And their contributions, they go beyond the science. Have you ever heard of remuge?
It's the technique where they turn the bottles to move the sediment into the neck, right? I've seen videos of it. It looks so tedious.
It is very labor intensive. And you know what's interesting? It might have originated in England. Again, driven by that British desire for crystal clear champagne.
That's amazing. This British connection runs deep. What else?
Well, with the demand for champagne, they needed to make a lot of it, quickly. And this led to the recognition of degorgement,
Which is,
removing the yeast sediment,
right.
another innovation spurred by the British thirst for bubbly.
It really seems like we wouldn't have champagne as we know it today. Without the British, they were more than enthusiasts. They were innovators.
Absolutely.
But it sounds like it goes beyond the technical aspects.
It does.
Didn't they also shape the whole image and culture around champagne?
You're on the right track. In England, champagne became more than just a drink. It became a status symbol.
Like a luxury item?
Exactly. It was in their art and literature, a fixture at every celebration.
It was part of their culture.
The idea of a champagne lifestyle, that says it all.
Wow. So you weren't just shaping how it was made and tasted. They were shaping its image, its story.
Exactly. They elevated it to a symbol of luxury and celebration.
A symbol of sophistication.
And that status, it endures today. But here's another twist. The British didn't just drink champagne. They learned from it.
Oh, this is getting good.
And that brings us to a whole other chapter.
Okay, what happened next? Did they share all that knowledge? Or,
Well, let's just say all that knowledge and experience inspired the British to embark on their own adventure, their own sparkling winemaking adventure.
wait, are you saying the British started making their own champagne?
Not exactly champagne. That name is protected.
Right, of course.
But they were inspired by what they'd learned.
Makes sense.
They started using the same grapes, the same methods. And because of their champagne obsession, they were able to create some pretty impressive sparkling wines.
And I bet you got some recommendations from our sources on which ones we should check out.
Absolutely. Before we get into those bottles, we need to look at those British innovations again. Remember those stronger bottles? Well, they weren't just good for shipping to England. They helped the Champagne region itself scale up production safely.
I hadn't thought of that.
I can imagine a cellar full of exploding bottles. Would be fun for anyone.
Not at all.
And those porks in cages, they're such a quintessential part of champagne.
I know.
But they were refined because of British demand. They wanted their champagne to arrive perfect, bubbly, and ready to enjoy.
So those innovations became standard practice.
Exactly.
It really shows the ripple effect of their influence.
It does.
All right, I'm ready for the good stuff. Tell me about these English sparkling wines. What should we be looking for?
Well, a name you'll hear a lot is Knee Timber.
Knee Timber.
They're pioneers of the modern English sparkling wine movement. And their classic cuvee, it's a fantastic place to start. Elegant, complex, with that British dryness.
Oh, that famous British dryness. What other gems are on the list?
Ridgeview is another top producer. Their Fitzrovia Rosé, it's really special, vibrant, sophisticated, named after a London neighborhood.
Very cool. So quality and style, it seems like the British brought those same standards to their own winemaking.
They did, and it's important to remember, English sparkling wine isn't just about mimicking champagne. These wines have their own character. That reflects the terroir of southern England.
So what makes them different?
Well, they use the same grapes and methods,
Right.
but the soil and climate, they play a crucial role. Southern England has these chalky soils, similar to the Champagne region, and this gives the wines a minerality and freshness.
So English sparkling wine is like a cousin to champagne, sharing DNA, but with its own personality.
I like that analogy, and there's so many other producers out there. Gusbourne, Chappelldown, Hambledon, they're all making exceptional wines.
I'm adding all these to my list.
You should.
But before we move on, I want to go back to the cultural impact. It sounds like champagne was more than just a drink in Britain.
It was woven into their art, their literature, their concept of celebration and success.
So it wasn't just about drinking it,
It was about what it represented.
like a symbol.
Think about how it's portrayed in British novels and films.
Okay.
It's always associated with elegance, special occasions, sophistication.
Now that you mention it, I'm picturing James Bond. Tuxedo, shaken, not stirred martini, and of course a bottle of champagne in the background.
There you go. It's an iconic symbol, just as much as it is in France.
That's fascinating.
And it's interesting to consider how that image, so carefully crafted by the British, has influenced how champagne is perceived worldwide.
So it's not just the bubbles and the taste. It's the whole experience, the image, the feeling.
And the British played a key role in creating that.
Wow.
It's a case study in how one culture can influence a product, its story, its global image, and ultimately its success.
It makes you wonder what other things that we take for granted have these complex, intertwined origins.
Exactly.
I'm definitely going to be looking at champagne and sparkling wine in a whole new light. This has been a really eye-opening. I kind of want to pop a cork right now, whether it's French champagne or English sparkling wine. I'm raising a glass to the Brits for their unsung role in this bubbly saga. But before we wrap up, I'm curious, what surprised you the most about the British influence on champagne?
Honestly, it's the sheer depth and breadth of their impact. It goes so far beyond simply liking a glass of bubbly. They shaped the taste, they drove innovation, they pushed the science forward, and they wove champagne into their culture in a way that really affected everyone. It's a great reminder that even things we think we know can have hidden stories and connections.
So what does this mean for us today? Should we be ditching French champagne for English sparkling wine?
Not necessarily. It's more about appreciating how complex the story is. Enjoying champagne, whether it's from France or England, with an understanding of its history, the people who shaped it, the innovations that made it possible, that's what makes it special.
I think you've given our listeners a whole new way to think about their next glass of bubbly. Any final thoughts before we wrap up this deep dive?
I would encourage you to explore those English sparkling wines we mentioned. Experience how the British, inspired by champagne, created their own unique expressions of this drink. It's a testament to that cross-cultural influence.
And maybe, just maybe, this will spark a bit of curiosity in our listeners about the origins of other things we take for granted. Who knows what fascinating stories are waiting to be uncovered? That's it for this deep dive into the history of champagne and sparkling wine. But as always, the learning doesn't stop here. We've got tons of resources in the show notes for you to explore further. Cheers.
I'm curious, what stands out to you in all of this? What surprised you the most about the British influence on champagne?
Honestly, the sheer depth and breadth of it all, it goes way beyond just enjoying a glass of bubbly. They shaped the taste, they drove innovation, pushed the science forward, and they wove champagne into their culture in a way that had global repercussions.
Yeah. It's a reminder that even the things we think we know can have hidden stories.
And unexpected connections.
Absolutely.
So what does this all mean for us today? Should we all be ditching French champagne and grabbing a bottle of English fizz?
Not necessarily. It's more about appreciating the complexity of the story. Enjoying champagne, whether it's from France or England, with a newfound understanding of its history, the people, the innovations, that's what makes it special.
I think you've given our listener a whole new way to think about their next glass of bubbly. Any final thoughts before we wrap up this deep dive?
I'd encourage everyone to explore those English sparkling wines we mentioned. Experience firsthand how the British, inspired by champagne, have created their own expressions of this drink.
Yeah.
And it's a testament to that cross-cultural influence.
And maybe, just maybe, it'll spark some curiosity about the origins of other things we take for granted. Who knows what fascinating stories are waiting to be uncovered? That's it for our deep dive into the history of champagne, but the learning doesn't stop here. We've got tons of resources in the show notes for you to explore further. Cheers.